In this last part of the video series for vCenter, we're going to take a look at how we go about uploading an ISO image into the data store for the ESXI server, and then we're going to create a virtual. So I'm up here inside of my VMware lab environment, and I'm using Workstation Pro. So what I've had to do is I've had to reconfigure my network adapter to see my local area network. So this is the first thing you got to do. You got to be able to see where your ISO images are on the host machine. That's what I'm doing here. So I went into my network adapter and I just configured them, or configured it, for dynamic IP or DHCP. Now once that was done, I went up here to my virtual machine, and I'm using Windows 7 here to do this, but you can use any virtual machine. I went to settings, and up inside the settings I went to options, I went to shared folders, and again I mapped that drive over to my ISO images. Once I did that, I was able to then see that map drive up inside of my computer as the Z drive. And there it is. That's the ISO folder that I have on my host machine up inside of Dropbox. I can open this up, and now I can send to the root of my C drive any of the ISO images that I need to create a virtual machine up inside of the ESXI server. And the way we do that is real simple. Once I've got the map drive, I'm just going to go into my ISO images here. I'll just pick up a couple. I sent over the Windows 7 Pro, and I just say send to, and just send it to the root of my C drive. I did the same thing with the 2012 image. I just said right click, send to, root of my C drive. Now we close this out, and we go up into the root of my C drive. And we will see that I have a folder up here that I've already renamed. I called it Server 2012 R2. Has the ISO image and a key in it. And I did the same thing for my Windows 7 Pro. There's the ISO image and there's the product. I will be able to see these two ISO images when I rejoin my actual 2012 domain, which is not part of my local area network on which this host resides. My ESXI host is on another network, so if I launch the Vmware Vsphere client and I try to connect to it, it's just going to bomb out, so I'm not even going to bother. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click over here and we're going to reconfigure my network adapter to rejoin my 2012 network. So I'm going to go down here to TCP/IP version 4, and I'm going to tell it to use the following IP address. Once I have confirmed that my TCP/IP settings are correct, I'm just going to say OK. Say OK again, and then in just a moment I should be back over onto my other network. I'll go ahead and close this out. Now if that yellow triangle doesn't reappear, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up a command prompt. A couple different ways you can do this. You can just restart the machine, or I can open up command prompt, do an ipconfig /renew. I'll go ahead and hit enter. And it still thinks that it's using DHCP. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and restart it, and it'll come back up with this new configuration. Sometimes the TCP/IP.sys just gets wrapped around the NIC, and you just have to do this. Be right back in a moment. My machine has restarted, and now we have that yellow triangle that we're looking for. I'm going to go ahead and launch my VMware Vsphere client. In just a moment, it's going to pop up. And I've got the address already in there, so I'm going to type in my username, which is root. I'm going to type in that root password. And in just a moment, it's going to connect over to my ESXI server. And while it's doing that, I'm going to go ahead and give you a tour here real quick. Again, I have my domain controller up and running. This is my ESXI server, and I have my Windows 7 client. I'm not going to be using the vCenter today because it's such a memory hog, and that 8 gigabytes of memory just sucks the life out of everything else I've got, which just means that it's time for me to upgrade my hardware to 32 gigabytes of RAM, probably a dual processor, probably 8 core, and it's just one of those things, you know, you gotta do that upgrade every so many years, and now it's time for me. So we have the connection we need to add those ISO images to the data store, and we're going to do that next. We're just going to click on the summary tab here, and you'll see that I have one data store. I'm going to go ahead and just right click on the data store and say browse data store. And you'll see I've already created a folder in here. And I did that by going up here to the create a new folder. And I called that ISO images. Now I'm ready to do the uploading. Now to do the uploading, you have to highlight the folder, and you go to this icon right here, and it says upload files to this data store. We're going to upload a file. And I'm going to go over here to the root of my C drive, and you'll see that I have that Windows Pro. Go ahead and just double click that ISO image, and if a file or folder in the target location has the same name as the one being copied, it will be replaced. Do you want to continue? And I'll say don't show that message again, and I'll say yes. And now it's going to copy over the process. When this one gets done, we'll copy over the ISO for Server 2012. We're now ready to upload our second ISO image. So again, I'm going to highlight that folder, go up here to my stacked disk icon, and we're going to upload another file. And this time, it's going to be the Windows 2000, or the Server 2012 ISO. And again, it just takes a few minutes for it to copy over. Now you may be asking, why do I even bother? Well, that's because there's some restrictions with the ESXI server and how it accesses ISO images. If they're not in the data store, then they have to be in a physical presence up inside of either your DVD or your CD-ROM, so that the Vmware ESXI server can access it. So I'm going to make it easy for my server to build the VM by just including those ISO images up inside of its data store, which is another option that we have creating the VM. We can use an existing ISO image in our data store. We'll be right back once this ISO image finishes uploading to my data store. I now have both my ISO images up inside of my data store, and we're now ready to proceed on with creating our first virtual machine. Before we start this process of actually creating our first VM, make sure that you're in the inventory view. That's what we're looking at here right now. This is the inventory view. Alright, so we're going to right click on our ESXI server, and we're just going to select a new virtual machine. Under most circumstances, the typical configuration works just fine, but for this demonstration, we're going to go ahead and select custom so that we can view all the different options that are available. So I'm going to go ahead and select custom, and I'm going to click on next. On this next window, this is where we name our virtual machine. So this is how we're going to identify this virtual machine. So I'm going to go ahead and create a virtual install of Server 2012, and that's what I'm going to call this. I'm just going to call it Server 2012 R2, just like that. Let's click next. Now the data store is where we're going to locate or store our virtual machines. So we only have one data store, but if we had multiple data stores, then we could choose which one we wanted for the storage of this virtual machine. I'm going to go ahead and accept the default and click on next. On this next window, we want to check and make sure that we are going to be using the latest version so that we get all the features. So I'm going to go ahead and select 10. We're going to click next. Here's where we choose the virtual machine that we're going to create. So I've chosen Windows, and we're going to pull down the window here, and we're going to select Windows Server 2012 64-bit. Now it's very important that you do select the right version so that the VMware does give you all the latest drivers that you're going to need for this install to work properly. We're going to go ahead and click next. On this next window, we have to select the number of CPUs we want to assign to this virtual machine. Now you can assign a couple of CPUs if you have them available, or you can just leave it as the default, but you got to know what you're doing here, because you can slow down the entire server if you take too many resources and apply it just to one VM. So you have to know what's going on in your hardware. I'm going to go ahead and just select 2 here. Now make sure you read all this, because there is a licensing issue for some virtual installs of server operating systems. The more CPUs, the more you have to pay Microsoft. So we're going to go ahead and say next to this. Just as it was with the CPU, the same rules apply with RAM. This RAM is going to be taken from your host machine, so be careful how much you allocate. You have to understand that there's a fine line between giving it enough and not giving it enough, but you have to know how to figure that out. So we're going to go ahead and leave it at the default at 4 gigs, but if my machine, my host machine, didn't have enough RAM, then giving this too much RAM is going to affect the performance. So make sure you understand what you're doing. I'm going to go ahead and say next to this. Depending on the number of NICs that are assigned to your host will depend on how many network adapters you can configure for your VM. Now, of course, the more network adapters that you have, the more networks you're going to be able to communicate with. I only have one network adapter, so we're just going to go ahead and move on. Click Next. On this next screen, we're going to select the SCSI controller. Normally, we can just go ahead and leave it at the default, and that's fine. But if you're going to import a virtual machine, then you're going to have to make sure that you select and use the same SCSI controller that is currently installed inside of that imported virtual machine, or the virtual machine may not start. We're going to go ahead and say Next. We're going to create a brand new disk because we don't have an existing one, so we're going to go ahead and say Next to this. And here we can set the size of this disk. Now, thick provisioning means that it's going to take the allocation and use it all at once. We recommend, or I recommend, that you use the thin provisioning, as this will only use the disk space for the file growth as it is needed. For this demonstration, I'm going to knock this down because I just don't have the space on this host to allocate it a 40 gigabyte partition. So what we're going to do is just knock this down. We're going to go to 12 gigs. Now, make sure that you do this right the first time, and also understand that if you don't, it's not a big deal. You can always go in and you can expand that partition using the Vmware tool. We're going to go ahead and say Next. We can leave the advanced options as they are. No need to mess with that. We're going to go ahead and click on Next. And now we can go ahead and check all of our settings that we used and make sure that everything is correct in the way we want it. And we can go ahead and click. The creation has completed successfully, and we can see that by going down here and looking inside of our recent task window. And now we'll see that this virtual machine is now present underneath my ESXI server. Our first step is to right-click on our new virtual machine, and we're going to go to Edit Settings. Now, once you're up inside of the settings for this virtual machine, you're going to click on CD DVD Drive 1, and over here you're going to go down to where it says Data Store ISO file. You're now going to browse on over to that file that we created earlier, and we're going to open up our ISO images folder, and we're going to select the ISO for Server 2012. We're going to go ahead and say OK to that. We're now ready to power on our new virtual machine and begin the installation for Server 2012. So we can right-click here, and we can say Power On, and now we can go on over to the Console tab. Go ahead and let it boot up, and in just a moment it will begin the installation for the Server 2012. That concludes this video series on installing vCenter and the ESXI server and creating a virtual machine up inside of ESXI. So if you have any problems, you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact your instructor. I'll talk with you later. Bye.